Now, Nick pointed out to some laughter in the room, well, this is no more vague than most of the Constitution. And he didn't intend that as a joke. I'm sure he didn't. Fact is, we all know that there's a lot of stuff in the Constitution that is very vague, very ambivalent. And somebody might say, well, so what's new? Article 5 is no different from the Bill of Rights, the word liberty, the commerce power, but there are some fundamental differences. First of all, we have developed orderly procedures over the past couple of centuries for resolving those ambiguities, but no comparable procedures for resolving these. Second, difficult interpretive questions about the Bill of Rights or the scope of the taxing power or the commerce power tend to arise one at a time, while questions surrounding the convention process would more or less need to be resolved all at once. And third, the stakes in this instance are vastly greater, because what you're doing is putting the whole Constitution up for grabs. You don't have to worry about running away with it in order to say, well, let's see, are we really up to it the way we were lucky enough to have those guys up to it in 1787? I mean, there was a bond that connected them. Even though they differed on issues like slavery, they'd all come out of the Revolution. They were lucky enough to have Hamilton, Madison, Franklin, and they had a George Washington to preside. I don't know what you think about the current cast of political characters, but I look around in vain to see a Hamilton or a Madison, or for that matter, a Franklin or a Jefferson, not to mention a Washington. It's great that we, people of very different views, can talk and converse, but the stakes in this conversation are relatively limited. We may convince ourselves and one another a little, but we haven't put the whole Constitution of the United States on the table, and it's actually served us pretty well. It's not as though it's been a massive failure. We did have to go through a civil war to overcome some of its deficiencies, but I think it's done pretty well by us. There's also a deep contradiction between what some people have to assume in order to favor a convention, to make deep structural changes. They have to assume that it's all up for grabs, that Article 5 is not going to be binding, that, for example, the rule that every state gets the same number of votes isn't going to be binding, and the point of view that others who want a convention for a more substantive purpose, like getting rid of Citizens United, or reducing the powers of the national government, or increasing the powers of the national government, those substantive objectives, the people who favor a convention to do something substantive tend to fall back, as the introductory materials for this conference do, on the idea that it all is going to fit neatly into the existing Article 5 framework that takes 3/4 of the states to ratify. Well, that's an assumption, of course, that you can't make if you really want to put the whole structure up for grabs. Now, there are people like Barbara Perry who argue that even though these legal questions are unanswered, that there are something like half a dozen political constraints, although she included a Supreme Court check as among the political constraints, and I have my doubts about that. There are political constraints that can substitute for the legal ones under our current situation. But it seems to me that the very thing that is said to make a convention essential is the supposed failure of our political process, its polarization, its paralysis, its capture by special interests. And to rely on that supposedly failed process in order to provide a backstop so that putting the whole Constitution on the table up for grabs is a good idea at this point in our history seems to me to be to sort of live in two different worlds at once. One world that says ordinary politics has totally broken down and we can't trust it, and the other world that says we can trust ordinary politics in order to make it a safe bet to put the Constitution on the table up for grabs. Now, it's true, I'm not suggesting that we should never do that. There are times in our history when it was appropriate. I think 1787 was such a time. And the reason is that even though, as Larry Lessig said at the beginning, there were the deepest divisions between those who believed that slavery should persist and those who wanted abolition, there was at least a general agreement on the direction in which we should move, the direction of creating a more perfect union, which is what the preamble talks about. Because there was fear that the Articles of Confederation created too much centrifugal force. We were flying apart. We had succeeded in a revolution, but we really were not going to hold together unless we had a more central government. George Washington couldn't even raise money for the troops for the Continental Army without volunteers from the states. We needed to move in that direction. But today, whatever the depth of our disagreements, the vectors point in different directions. Some of us in this room want a weaker central government and more states' rights. Others want a central government that is more capable of countering corporate power over our politics. We don't even agree in what direction to go. And so I'm afraid that at this moment in our history, calling a convention a creature whose fundamental composition, whose DNA we barely understand, would not make a lot of sense, especially because I'm not ready to give up even on politics, believe it or not. Take the views of the Tea Party. It's been remarkably successful in moving the Republican Party in the direction that it likes, in moving the Republican caucus in a direction that takes more seriously the problems of national debt. Hasn't gotten rid of Obamacare, but I wouldn't be sure that it won't succeed in doing that. To say at this moment that politics is broken, we have to put the Constitution up for grabs in a new convention seems to me to be risking something that has stood us in enormously good stead over the course of 2 centuries, something that has been the model for the world. American exceptionalism is in large part the result of constitutional exceptionalism. Of course it has to adapt to changing times. I agree with Sandy Levinson that that was the greatest line in the greatest Supreme Court decision of all. A constitution that will endure for the ages. But for the Constitution to endure for the ages, we have to continue the intergenerational conversation that links us to the framers and that enables us to move toward a more perfect union, not necessarily put it all up for grabs, which is why, although I'm trying to have as open a mind as possible about this, the doubts I have about the wisdom of a new convention, not a runaway convention, but any convention, overcome my desire to experiment. And I do want to end by thanking again both Larry Lessig and Mark Meckler, because I think that the conversation they have begun here, whether it leads to more discussion of a convention or not, is something that is long overdue, and I'm proud to be a part of it. Thank you so much.
So